Hi everyone, this is Erica from Gokce Capital, and today we have a new parcel of land for sale. Now before I begin, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications. In 1290, the lords of England traveled to the court of the king to stop a pyramid scheme. The lords were at the top of this pyramid, and yet they could feel the base beneath their feet starting to crumble, and they had a radical idea of how to repair the structure. Now, in England at this time, all land was owned by the king, but certain lords were granted the right to use large estates in exchange for certain services and fees owed to the king. In turn, the great lords granted portions of their land to lower lords in exchange for similar services and fees, as well as additional dues, called aids, owed at certain events, such as when the lord's daughter was married. This practice of dividing land was called subfeudation. This process was at first very profitable for the great lords, but then of course the lower lords wanted to subfeudate their lands as well. And when the land was subfeudated, many of the additional aids owed were directed to the lower lord and taken from the original. As this process continued down the pyramid, the great lords saw their income much reduced. So what did they do? They imposed a law that prevented subfeudation. Moving forward, if a lower lord or knight wanted to dispose of their property, they had to sell it outright. Suddenly, land was a commercial commodity, and this change brought down feudal England. But more on that later. Today, of course, there is no question that land is a commercial commodity, and an investor can even make a profit off of land without ever owning it. Or sometimes, a profit can be made by owning the land for just a few minutes, in a process known as a double closing. And if you are thinking of investing in land or real estate, here are a few things you should know about the double closing and how it can benefit you. Number 1. A double closing is when an investor purchases a property and then immediately sells it. There are thus two independent real estate deals in a double closing, one between the investor and the seller, and the other between the investor and the final buyer. Number 2. As I just mentioned, there are two independent transactions in a double closing. So the process works something like this. A real estate investor finds a seller. The investor and seller agree on a price and sign a purchase agreement. The investor then goes out and finds an end buyer. The buyer and the investor agree on a price and sign a separate purchase agreement. The investor then obtains funding in order to purchase the property from the seller. The first closing will occur. The investor purchases the property, and immediately after, the second closing occurs when the investor sells the property to the end buyer. And the funds from the end buyer are used to repay the investor's loan, if the investor took out one, and the difference between the purchase price and the sales price represents the investor's profit. Number 3, because the investor does technically purchase the property, even if it's just for a few minutes, they do need to find funding for the purchase. And several options are utilized. An investor can use their own cash, but they can also take out a traditional mortgage loan. Although these are not the typical methods that are used to fund the deal. Investors will often use not a traditional mortgage loan, but a hard money lender or flash cash. These are essentially short-term loans that are taken out in some cases for only a few days. Now, they do often come with higher interest rates, but the advantage is that these kinds of lenders are more willing to be involved in double closings. They also may have a much faster application process to help ensure that you get the deal moving quickly. But the other most commonly used funding option is to use the end buyer's funds to purchase the property. When this happens, a reverse closing occurs, in which the sale between the investor and the end buyer happens first. The funds from the end buyer go into escrow and are immediately used to purchase the property. Now, this last option is usually seen as the ideal way to fund a deal because the investor does not have to put up their own funds or pay any interest or closing costs on a loan. However, many end buyers are not willing to agree to this kind of structure. Number 4, double closings can be illegal or difficult. Some states do have laws against double closings, but having said this, it's also important to note that double closings are in fact legal in many states. However, even when a double closing is legal, you may find that title companies and real estate attorneys decline to perform double closings. There are many reasons for this, but often it's because title companies are risk adverse and they see a double closing as more risky, or at the very least, more complicated than a traditional closing. In addition, as I just mentioned, double closings are more complicated by their very nature. Thus, a double closing has a higher likelihood of falling apart than a regular closing. Number 5. Double closings are more complicated, and thus many investors prefer to use an assignment instead. However, there are instances when an investor wants to hide the profit that they will be making from the deal from both their seller and their end buyer, and a double closing is the best way to do this. As I mentioned before, an assignment is another option that an investor can use when they don't want to purchase a property, but rather make what is essentially a finder's fee. In this case, the investor never purchases the property, but they get an assignment fee for finding and locking up the property. As you can imagine, this has a lot of advantages over the double closing. The problem is that the assignment fee that the investor is making will be known to both the seller and the end buyer. With a double closing, the end buyer never meets the seller and doesn't even need to know how much the investor is paying for the property. The same is true on the other end of the deal. So when an investor is dealing with a high-value deal, where their profit may be very large, they may opt to use a double closing to avoid having either the seller or the buyer try to negotiate down their profit. And number 6. If you do decide that a double closing makes more sense than an assignment on your deal, you may need to do some networking to find an attorney who will perform the closing. As we mentioned earlier, many attorneys try to avoid handling double closings. And one of the easiest ways to find an attorney who will work with you is through other investors. So there you have it. A double closing is a creative way to make a profit from the sale of real estate without even having to risk your own money in many circumstances. But it never would have been possible without the 1290 law mentioned at the beginning of this video, which effectively formalized the practice of exchanging money for land. This law, the quia imptores, birthed the notion of private property and, some have argued, eventually destroyed feudalism. And the effects of this law are still present, even today, in United States land laws. So if you have ever been fortunate enough to make money from real estate investments, you have this law to thank. Now, do you have any stories about double closings? Let us know in the comments. Did you like this video? You're going to love our Gokce Land Due Diligence program. We'll make you a land due diligence expert in just 7 days. Check it out at gokcecapital.com/glad. And while you're at our website, don't forget to explore our $1 down properties at gokcecapital.com/listings. Finally, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. You can email, call, or text, and we will respond as soon as possible. So thank you for listening, and more to come.